Camille was a child of the tropics, an offspring of the sea and the wind. She was born in the Caribbean on August the 9th, 1969. She grew to maturity and moved across the Gulf of Mexico toward the hospitable shores of Southern America. But this time, there would be no warm welcome. Camille was no lady. Oh, she was a lethal storm, the most disastrous and destructive hurricane ever to bring havoc to this nation.
That's the news on WROA. Coastal weather indicates today is going to be another nice day with no rain and a high near 70, northeast winds on the Gulf and seas 2 to 4 feet. Tropical storm Camille continues on a west-northwesterly path in the western Caribbean with top winds in excess of 50 miles per hour. The National Hurricane Center in Miami says continuing intensification would result in the storm reaching hurricane strength within the next 24 to 48 hours. Listen for the next advisory here on WROA.
Now, people living along the Mississippi Gulf Coast are used to hurricane bulletins. So on August the 15th, 1969, when they heard in Biloxi, Gulfport, past Christian and other places along here, that a hurricane called Camille was forming over the Caribbean, they hardly gave her a second thought. But 2.5 days later, Camille had become a hurricane they would never forget. One tragic night, Camille wiped out an area of over 68 square miles. A massive response to an evacuation order put out by civil defense departments before the hurricane struck saved at least 50,000 lives. But foolishly, some stayed on.
And Junior, darling, we all right, sweetheart. I love you. Now, don't worry about us. We all right, darling. And hello to all of you. Thank the Lord. Another one will never catch us here, because if we hear of another one coming, we're leaving here and go way upstate like you asked Mama to do. So, okay, now, I love y'all.
Those who spent the night in hurricane shelters were among the first to see how bad it was. 5,700 homes gone and another 14,000 severely damaged. No food, no water, no power, no nothing. As they picked through the wreckage in the hope of finding something, however small, to call their own, it was hard to believe that this was not just a bad dream. It was even harder to remember exactly how it began.
WROA. Reconnaissance aircraft from the National Weather Service's Hurricane Hunters this morning flew missions into Camille as it nears the western tip of Cuba. The Hurricane Center in Miami reports after evaluating this morning's data that the center of the storm is extremely intense with top winds near 115 miles per hour. We're watching the storm very closely and we'll keep you advised throughout the day. I'm Ben Sutteth on WROA. Struck western Cuba during the night. Heavy property damage has been reported, with Cuban authorities saying an undetermined number of people were killed by the storm's fury on western Cuba during the night. Camille is now moving toward the open Gulf, with highest sustained winds estimated by reconnaissance aircraft at 100 miles per hour.
After she had played with the Cubans on August the 15th, Camille took another gulp of warm, moist air that sustained her and headed for Florida. Now, weathermen there, plotting what they knew was a storm of great intensity, had the understandable desire to be somewhere else. Our chief weatherman, Bob Simpson, said, "Never before had a population been threatened by a hurricane as dangerous as Camille." And he was right. The hurricane's interior had in it over 80 tornadoes. The course that a hurricane will take is hard to predict, and Camille was no exception. The evaluation of satellite pictures and other data now indicated that she was veering away from Florida and straight for a 26-mile stretch of coastline on the Gulf of Mexico called the American Riviera. Thousands of buildings along this beach were just 10 feet above sea level. Their destruction was 15 hours away.
When we received news that the hurricane would come into our coast rather than the Florida coast, plans that had been long since developed were put into effect as to evacuate the community. And the job was about 90% complete about 3:30 that afternoon when we received the shocking, almost unbelievable news that rather than a 15-foot tide and a 150-mile wind, we could expect tides in excess of 20 feet above normal with at least a 10-foot sea on top of that. Winds well in excess of 200 miles an hour, so increased emphasis had to be placed on the remaining evacuation job to be done.
7 WROA News. Hurricane Camille, the most dangerous storm of the century, is now bearing down on the Mississippi coastline. An evacuation of offshore oil rigs in the Gulf took place earlier today after wind gauges aboard a drilling rig of the Mobil Oil Company recorded winds of sufficient strength to threaten the safety of those on board.
But there were those who refused to go. Some newcomers to the area who had never experienced a major hurricane, they wouldn't believe that their lives could be in danger. Others said that they had lived through hurricanes before, and some were afraid of looters, so they stayed where they were. 25 more decided to just ignore Camille and, believe it or not, have a party.
This is John Fitzgerald at the Emergency Operations Center with a bulletin for all residents of the Mississippi coast. Civil Defense Director Wade Geis has just said that Hurricane Camille will strike the Mississippi coast within a matter of hours. All coastal residents are advised and urged to leave the area at once. The storm is now only 20 miles offshore, with landfall expected during the night. Camille has winds nearing 200 miles per hour, meaning it could be the most powerful hurricane to ever strike the United States. For your personal safety, you are urged to leave the area now. Your civil defense urges you to evacuate now.
The winds would soon exceed 230 miles per hour. After that, the recording instruments just disintegrated.
People who think about a hurricane think about big winds, and they are big winds, there's no question about that. But the most devastating element associated with a hurricane is big water. We call this the storm surge. This is a dome of water maybe 50 miles wide that sweeps across the coastline near the point where the eye makes landfall. Storm surge is just like a giant bulldozer. It just sweeps everything in its path.
To button up rescue operations about 10:30 because the sea had come over all the roads. Rooftops were scattered all over the place, transformers exploding. It was a pitiful thing indeed. I recall receiving many telephone calls and wondered how in the world they even had a line into the office. One poor woman called and said, "I'm here with my children. The roof is blown off of the house. Please come and help me," knowing very well that there's no way to get to her.
As we started up the stairway, which is on the outside of the building, the winds reversed and came back through again. My second oldest son and I were holding the hand of our 3-year-old at the time. And he had to crawl up the stairs because the winds had gotten so bad, and he was just like a sail in the wind. And my husband had our youngest, who was a year old at the time, and as he was going up the stairway, the wind grabbed him out of his arms, and he grabbed him by the ankle, and it was the only thing that had saved him. There was another family there that night that the same thing had happened to, only their little girl wasn't grabbed, and they never found her. She was lost in the Gulf.
Not only did we have the water damage and the wind damage, but we had explosions that was created by buildings being closed tightly, a heavier pressure inside the building than the pressure on the outside of the building, and the buildings exploding.
The house next door to the one we rented out, it lifted in its entirety from the foundation. If that whole house, with that force of the wind behind it, would have hit ours, it would have been cinder. It turned momentarily, 180 degrees, and the wind took it and just blew it away in the Gulf of Mexico.
Began to break down, and it wasn't long before the wind just took us right off into the water. And I went down, and when I came up, I found a board, and I grabbed onto the board, but it whirled and got away from me. So I went down again, and the next time I came up, I was fortunate enough to catch onto 3 or 4 boards and just took off. I didn't, we had 5 buildings on the house, but I didn't touch anything. I evidently just went right down the back road out. I went right over the railroad track and didn't even touch it, so the water was that high.
Finally, the water got so high that we had to actually swim from there all the way to the chimney and then make our way up on the roof. But I built this chimney. It was 18 feet high. They say it was 23 feet of water. So you can see, you can just about imagine what that force of water and wind could do with the home.
The next morning, the house, the foundation, contents, personal effects, and
everything was just gone. And then finally, daylight came, and when we got off the roof, we were still way above our waist, and we made it way out and walked out, and all you could see, no more homes. All our friends and all our relatives, no more homes, nothing.
Gulfport, Mississippi, returning to the air. Our coastline has virtually been destroyed by the fury of Hurricane Camille, and it's feared that many lives have been lost. The death toll cannot be determined as the bodies of the hurricane's victims are being dug from beneath tons of debris by the hour. Highways and roads have been buckled and destroyed, with only the twisted steel beams remaining for once massive buildings. Our once beautiful coast is now covered with death and devastation.
That great when you do that smile.
felt sorry for were the elderly, the people who could not start again. They could get a loan. Sure, they could rebuild a house, but they'd leave this world long before they'd ever be paid for.
There was not enough money in the world to compensate these people for what they'd been through, but vast amounts of state and federal aid would soon pour into the stricken areas. From other states, the Red Cross, and the military. Assistance came of every kind: food, clothing, mobile homes, money. Everything necessary to help rebuild their shattered lives.
I didn't know what to do. I didn't know which way to turn, who to talk to, where to go, where to start. Where was I going to eat tonight? Where was I going to sleep? I could find very little of my things here on the place at all. I had lost my wonderful TV, but 3 other people's TVs broken up on the place. 5 refrigerators were here. Mine wasn't. There were 2 different houses. The house next door, which was a wooden house, was piled up in my driveway. The house up the highway was piled up in another stack of lumber outside of my gate. My home that I had built myself out of sweat and tears and a few dollars was gone.
The Colonel's home, or a house of God that had withstood hurricanes for 130 years, it made no difference to Camille. The church caretaker, Paul Williams, had taken his family there to pray. Only he survived. When the church came down, with it went 10 children, 3 grandsons, and Myrtle, his wife. Paul Williams had faced the storm believing in God's protection, while others in the Richelieu apartments nearby put their faith in bricks and mortar and had that party. The police and city officials had begged those living here to leave for higher ground. 25 stayed on, 24 perished.
And the windows in our front, they were just moving back and two. So I told my husband, Fritz, I said, we've got to get away from here. I said, this wind's going to blow them in any time, you know. So we went back to the bedroom, and it was just a matter of an hour for the water burst the front windows in. In our apartment, you had the living room and dining room, and there was a door that separated our bedroom. So we both got our shoulders together and was holding the door, trying to keep the water from coming back where we were. And in the meantime, the tidal wave had come in, and it came in and smashed our windows in, smashed them in. And the water was in there. And finally got up to around, it was about halfway. Our bed was floating halfway to the ceiling. And I looked up and I told Fritz, I said, that 3rd floor is coming in. The caving in. You could see the big cracks in the wall, and the whole building was just swaying. So I told him he couldn't swim. I blew him up a little raft and gave it to him. And I told him, I said, I'm taking the flashlight and swimming. I said, I'm going to die, but I'm going to die fighting. And so I swam out the window, and it was so high until the electric wires on the telephone pole and everything had got tangled up. I got tangled up in it and couldn't get out. And I saw him, and he was yelling for me to come save him. The water had washed him out, but he went right on under, and there was nothing I could do. So I finally got loose, and as I did, you could see the top floor where they was having the hurricane parties. All the lamps were lit, and I was trying to push away because I had always heard that, you know, if a ship goes under, that the suction pulls you under. So I thought, well, if the building goes, and it's going to suck me under with it. So I was trying to swim away from the building, and as I was swimming, and the tidal wave was carrying me along, it was carrying the building along with me, and you could see as it was gradually sinking, you could see the top floor with the people and the lamps sink down underneath. Of course, there was nothing I could do, and I was swimming on. And the water was so high, it was over all the trees. I thought I was out in the Gulf, and I kept thinking, well, they're going to be looking for survivors on land, and I didn't know how long I could survive, you know, swimming out in the Gulf. But anyhow, kept going, and as I was swimming along, it was just so horrible, and it was so dark you couldn't see anything. And all the furniture in the apartments had gotten smashed up, and it was just pieces of wood with nails and everything. And you wasn't really swimming. You'd swim and something would come by and you'd hold on to it for a minute, you know, and then it'd be ripped out of your arms and everything. My head to my toes, I was just ripped open with nails and bleeding all over. And so the big tree came, and it had a bunch of stuff on it. Well, I climbed on it thinking, you know, it'd give me a breathing space and all, but all the debris kept getting in the tree, and it was, you know, going with us. It had been uprooted, and when it got weighted so much, then it tipped over, and when it tipped over, it tipped and made me go down, and I had to keep diving further and further down, and every time I'd come up, there'd be debris, and I was pushing, trying to get my way in, and then I'd have to dive further. Finally, I was just about to give out, you know, and my legs were real strong because I had done cocktail waitress work for so many years. So I took my legs and pried a hole, and then got up, and it started smashing my chest, but finally I climbed up over it and swam away from it. So from then on, when trees would come by, I'd always get on the top and over to the side, so when they'd go down, I could, you know, dive off and swim away, because it's the only thing that was giving me a little breathing space. And the wind was going so fast and everything until it was so hard to even breathe.
After decimating the coast, Camille moved inland. Her winds fell to a mere 70 or 80 miles per hour. She seemed less dangerous. Then, on unprepared Virginia, she dropped 27 inches of rain. In flooded Virginia, the catalog of death and destruction almost equaled that of Mississippi. On August 20th, Camille flew out over the Atlantic and went wherever hurricanes go to die.
Within 3 days, she killed over 300 people. Now, other hurricanes had caused more deaths in the past, but none had ever brought greater havoc. The cost of repairs came to a record-breaking $1.25 billion. This greatest storm was followed by the biggest cleanup and rebuilding operation in hurricane history. And many who were involved and came out of it could be proud of themselves. Soon Biloxi, Pass Christian, Gulfport, and other devastated areas had rebuilt, often better than before. Now today, they are watched over by probably the best hurricane early warning system in the world. Now one day, scientists hope to reduce the hurricane menace by chemical means, but until that time comes, no one who met Camille in 1969 will ignore an order to evacuate before a hurricane. That's for sure.